this EPI. So we're going to invite President Choi Jae-chul to be our moderator. It was an honor to have Professor Martin Wolf and hear his lecture, how the EPI could play a pivotal role for a better and sustainable future. And his lecture contained a lot of informative and instructive contents. For companies and countries and groups, when they actually exaggerate their actual actions just for the purpose of their image improvement, there arises a greenwashing issue. In this regard, Professor Wolf's data-based implementation and performance evaluation is very useful in improving the objectivity, integrity, and transparency of the evaluation. In 2022, EPI established 3 political areas: climate, environmental health, and ecosystem vitality, as well as 11 issue categories and 40 performance indicators in the evaluation system. And I find it very impressive. And now I have a few questions, maybe rather general questions, maybe trivial or more detailed. So do you hear me okay, Mr. Wolf? Yep. So when Yale University and Columbia University Centers measure different countries' EPIs, through what channel or path do they collect the data of each index? Also, do they use only the officially announced data of each country, or in the event that the data is insufficient, do they ask for additional data from that country's government? And do they evaluate the collected data on their own? Also, or do they communicate with the parties of interest in the evaluated countries for accuracy and transparency of that data? If you could answer, please.
Thank you very much for that kind overview and kind remarks of the Environmental Performance Index. I couldn't agree more that one of the main uses of the EPI is to verify some of the claims that companies and countries are saying about their performance. You mentioned the sources of our data, and I'm so glad you asked about that, because these data-driven metrics only work if you have very good and accurate data that you're considering in your rankings and in your analyses. So in that spirit, we don't accept data directly from countries themselves. Rather, we utilize data that's been verified by a third party, typically something like the United Nations or an academic research institution. These third parties accept data coming from countries and then verify it and clean it and try and ensure that it matches up with other estimates of fisheries health or greenhouse gas emissions or air quality. We do this because we want to ensure that we're using the same data source for all countries. And in a lot of circumstances, we consider 180 countries around the world. We actually consider more than that, but we only have enough data for 180 countries. Not all of these countries have the resources to be able to send us their data. So by using these third-party data sources, we're actually able to consider in our rankings many more countries than we otherwise might be able to if we worked directly with countries. That being said, I just want to emphasize that we're very open to working with environmental and health ministries and researchers in all countries, coordinating between the countries and our data partners to get the latest data and the latest research happening within these countries into our analyses. Because we recognize that the people who best know the conditions on the ground in the country are often the people in those countries themselves. So when we can't rely on satellite data, for example, we often work with on-the-ground measurements in those countries and try and incorporate those into our data sources.
감사합니다. 특히
Thank you. The most updated and accurate data is being used, which is really desirable. Now, for OECD, They've been carrying out EPI evaluations on its member countries and partner countries since 1992. And for their evaluation reports to be produced, it takes over a year, like a year and a half. And you said you announce the reports every 2 years, right? And how long does it take for you to complete the EPI evaluation? And talking about this supply field evaluation, investigation, do your teams actually visit on site?
제가 아는 바로는 실제로 공급망을 방문해서 검증을 해본 적은 없습니다.
And the reason why we do it every 2 years is because we spend the first year taking a step back and considering new data sources that have been produced and also new sustainability issues that we haven't tracked before. So we take a year to basically start from scratch and really delve deep into the latest scientific research and sustainability policymaking, and then take the second year to refine our methodologies and our calculations. So it's a two-step process, driven both by statistics and math, but also making sure that the data, the statistics and math, are grounded in the latest scientific environmental and sustainability research.
네, 감사합니다. 교수.
Thank you. Towards the end of your lecture, you mentioned it's really important to have the better ESG calculation method. For ESG evaluation, actually evaluating institutions and indexes are mushrooming and it can be problematic. Last July, The Economist claimed on its special number, we argue that ESG is deeply flawed. Drop the S and the G and shift the E from environment to emissions. Meaning that ESG has a lot of flaws and errors, therefore the social governance should be dropped out and E, environment, should shift it towards emission. Maybe that's more appropriate, according to The Economist. So basically their take is that the ESG is diluting the focus of the public on the significance and severity of the climate crisis. So I would like to hear what's your take on this.
Thank you for that important question. I can't agree with The Economist's position on that, and that's because I think it's impossible to separate out the environmental from the social and the governance. We know that pollution emissions and climate change have huge impacts on society, and we know that governance and policies are so tightly linked to environmental performance. So I don't think it's right, and I don't think it will be successful to focus only on the environmental side of things, because to improve the environmental part of the equation, to improve the E, we also need to have changes in how society runs and governance and policies. So I think that there's a reason why ESG, environmental, social, and governance, are linked together. And that's because they all impact one another. So it's really hard to separate one out from the other.
예, 이 분야에서는 저도 교수님 의견에
Honestly, I agree with Professor Wolf because G, the governance, has when they care less about environment and climate issues, you can't actually implement any actions, right? So they do complement and impact one another. Now, just up to a few years ago, many companies tried to promote their corporate image by investing a lot of money and time in CSR activities. Now, recently, since like 2020, for companies, ESG has emerged as kind of a new management strategy for inducing and securing investors for companies. However, some claim that ESG is nothing more than mere CSR plus version. So how would you explain the difference between the CSR and ESG?
That's an excellent question. And we have to be wary that if we come up with a new name for something, but we're doing something very similar to what we were done before, it can make it look like we're doing something different and better, when in fact, we're doing exactly the same thing, just coming up with a new name for it. I actually do see a small difference between ESG and CSR, and that is I see ESG metrics as companies improving their own policies, kind of their own manufacturing, supply chains, basically improving their own internal policies. I see CSR as companies taking a step outside of their factory, outside of the fence surrounding their factory, and improving the neighborhoods and the communities that the companies reside in and operate in, which I think is good and valuable. Companies have great power to improve the lives of the people that not only work for them, but also the communities around them as well. We've seen this happening throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the relationship between workers and communities and companies is changing really rapidly. So I hope that this trend of better community engagement continues into the future.
네, 감사합니다. 어떻게 보면
Thank you. Whenever you have a new catchphrases, their initiatives must continue on developing, right? So the ESG can't be more important. The next question can be a little more detailed one. For the past 30 plus years, I've been working in the field on foreign affairs field, tackling climate issues. And since the Brazil COP, the main focus is the response to the climate issues. There are shared responsibilities and respective capability. And recent Paris Agreement, you heard that. So different circumstances for different countries are very important elements. Now, Yale University Center has developed and is announcing every year their API evaluation report on many countries. And when calculating emissions, also UN SDG goal emphasis on the consumption pattern, sustainable consumption pattern, right? But consumption happens more in advanced countries, but production pattern occurs. We emphasize sustainable production pattern, but it happens more in developing countries. Against this backdrop, when you can calculate EPI rankings, the COPs and other summits theme, CBTRC, how could those principles should be reflected?
Oh, sorry, I was muted, but I just want to thank the ambassador because you raised so many important issues there, and I'll try and respond to each of them in turn. One issue that's raised when we're computing global rankings, like the Environmental Performance Index, is whether or not it's fair to compare what's happening in developed countries to developing countries. In that respect, I actually feel that the best use of rankings coming out of the Environmental Performance Index is not comparing all countries to all other countries, but rather finding out who your peers are, who your peer countries are, in terms of your level of economic output, your kind of governance structures, your political structures. And seeing how you compare to your peers is more useful because by looking to your top performing peers, you might be able to identify policies that you can adopt and implement realistically with the financial and economic and political resources that you have within your own country. Ambassador, you also raise a really important point about sustainable consumption and production. And this is something that the EPI research team has been coordinating with our colleagues at Columbia and the United Nations and the University of Tokyo Center for Global Commons to better estimate and really better quantify using robust data the true environmental impact that some Western developed countries like the United States, where I am, better quantify how our emissions are really occurring in some of the more developing countries. For example, I have my iPhone right here that was produced not here in the United States, but some of the electronics were manufactured in South Korea. Some of the screens were manufactured in China. Right now, in a lot of ESG metrics and sustainability metrics, the pollutions from something that I am using here in my country are actually being accounted for as if the other country was emitting them, because the production happens in those countries. So this is a big problem, and it's something that we're working really hard on trying to develop better metrics. I encourage everyone, if they're interested in this, to actually look at the Environmental Performance Index sister report. It's called the Global Common Stewardship Index, that better quantifies the spillover of pollutants. And when we look at results coming out of reports like that, where we quantify the spillover of pollutants, a lot of countries that seem to do well at face value are actually having a big impact on the deterioration of the global commons, like the health of the ocean and climate change, because we're just outsourcing our pollution. So those are really critical points. And I encourage everyone to continue to ask these questions of policymakers who claim that countries are doing better or are being green. Really scrutinize the data and track where pollutants are coming from based on the export of goods and services, to come up with better estimates of countries or companies' true environmental impact.
예, 교수님 정말 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor. Ranking, among 180 countries may be less important, and but it can stimulate and drive one another, right, to really go a step forward to improve themselves. I really agree with you. And sustainability-based supply chain should also be firmly established through, different local society. And the Yale University and Columbia University Center's EPI evaluation report on many countries. I really look forward to their EPI evaluation contributing to the firm establishment of the ESG direction and standardization of the evaluation criteria. We'd like to thank you once again for being part of the first ESG International Conference held in Busan, one of the major cities in Korea. And I hope to see you in person next time. And for the second round of this conference, if you could provide us with some advice, please, and say thank you and bye.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I too hope to be there in person next time. I hope that by that point we'll have emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic as a more sustainable society and economy and a more sustainable world. And I thank you again for really taking the issue of robust and data-driven ESG metrics seriously. I welcome anyone to reach out to me with any questions they have in the future. I'm always happy to talk with you. So thank you again very, very much.
네, 고맙습니다. 이렇게 ESG 국제
Thank you. That's the end of the keynote session discussion. Please give them big hand once again.
네, 고맙습니다. 이렇게 계속해서 관련
Thank you. suggesting climate-related issues and seeking methods of solution together. It was a very meaningful time. So this concludes the keynote session, and we will continue right on to the session 1.